professor at the University of Ghent and specialize in Institute for Social Policy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here today and to be presenting some of our main results and takeaways from the WIO case study, which we called Working at the UN, What Does It Take? And I think this is the question we're all asking ourselves today, right? Before I start with presenting some of our main findings and takeaways, I would like to introduce and to thank my colleague Benedikt Hemmerle, who's in the audience today. And Benedikt is responsible for the data analysis part of this report, and he will also be available for your questions and comments after this presentation, as well as during the coffee break. So if you have any queries or needs for clarification, feel free to approach him. Alrighty, before we get to our actual case study, I would like to give you sort of a background information on the status quo on gender parity in the United Nations. And this serves as sort of the motivational impetus for actually conducting this case study. Now, these aspects here are taken from a highly recommended report by Paige Arthur, published in 2017, where she identified some of the most important gaps as concerns gender equality in the United Nations. And I think most of this are sort of intuitively already known, but it's good to have sort of the empirical evidence here and really be able to put these into numbers. So first of all, and this is something that we are probably familiar with from other sectors as well, like the private sector or academia, is the higher up you go in the UN hierarchy, the larger the gap in gender parity becomes. So there is sort of an internal, a leaky pipeline or bottleneck towards senior jobs for women. And this is, of course, important to know because while we do have this more or less balanced male and female ratio in entry-level jobs and at the sort of bottom of the hierarchy, women become scarcer and scarcer the higher up you go in the hierarchy. And this is something that needs to be addressed because, of course, the top jobs is where all the resources are, where all the prestige is, and where the power is. And this is also something I think we need to be aware of. Secondly, something that was also found is that while UN jobs are demanding clearly for both genders, they do affect women and men quite differently. And this has to do with the fact that the UN, just like any other organization, is embedded in wider social and cultural structures. And the fact that, unfortunately, it's still the case that women have to bear most of the load when it comes to childcare responsibilities, housework, and additional responsibilities in the private life. So this impacts back on their professional lives as well, clearly. And as an employer that is sensitive towards gender issues, these aspects should also be addressed more proactively by the United Nations. What was also found out is that there is sort of a gender segregation at work in the United Nations. So we have certain sectors and branches that are clearly dominated by male colleagues. These are traditionally male-connotated areas like logistics, engineering, and above all security. And needless to say, this is also where all the money is, especially security and peacemaking, right? These are the top jobs that get the most prestige and that are widest known in the public. On the other hand, we also have traditionally female-connotated areas also in the UN, mirroring sort of the larger labor market structure, and these would be humanitarian work, social work, health and education, which are just as important or even more important, some might say, but as you know, often not those areas where the resources are put into, unfortunately. What was also found out, and this brings me closer already to our case study, is that the hiring process, the recruitment process, often reveals a gender bias that might be unconscious but even conscious. Very often this is related to the fact that working at the UN involves relocating to other geographical locations, countries that might be more dangerous and less secure, where there is often a conscious bias towards recruiting women for these positions for reasons of security and safety. And of course this also has to be addressed, I think, very openly. And then finally, we've heard a lot of talk about gender equality, especially in the last couple of years. It's been at the top of the UN's agenda, but there has been little to no action. We have to be honest about that. So there seems to be sort of a lack of political will and also a lack of accountability. So while the UN has set itself quite ambitious goals as concerns gender balance within the organization, we don't know what will actually happen if these goals aren't reached, right? So what are the consequences? I'm afraid there won't be any, but we'll just have to try harder and that's it. But this is, of course, not how we actually achieve more equality. So it's also important to have more accountability here. And I briefly brought you just one main graph that I think really drives home this message here. And this looks at the distribution of Under-Secretary General positions. You might be familiar with these positions. These are sort of the heads of the individual agencies and sectors, one step below the Secretary General, right? So at the moment, there are more than 50 Under-Secretary Generals in the whole UN heading different agencies. 73% of these are male, which is already quite an imbalance, I would say. But the most important aspect here is that out of the whole budget that is managed by these Under-Secretary Generals, 95% of the whole budget is managed by a male Under-Secretary General, and only 5% of all the budget is managed by a woman. And so this also shows us that it's not only important to get more women into the system, but also to make sure that they actually have the power and the resources to do something and to make change happen. And I think this is really important also for the setting of this conference here. Yes, we want you to be able to make a move, have a foot in the door, get into the system, but also we want you to advance, right? And this already brings me to our case study, which Darline already introduced. Thank you. Just very briefly to recapitulate, our main goal really was to collect examples and to assess them critically. Examples of what works and what does not work when it comes to application, recruitment, hiring in the UN system. The aim of this was really to enhance the participation of women. As I said, for us, mainly the first step, getting a foot in the door, but also enhancing, in a later step, the advancement of women within the hierarchy. And this is, of course, connected to a much larger goal. It's connected to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, especially the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. So the outcomes of this case study, well, one outcome is this event here, I would say, and the fact that I'm able to present the main results to you. We also published quite a comprehensive policy paper, which will be available for download for free after this conference at the WIO website, so feel free to check it out. And I think most of you already got the executive summary, which is a 2-page conclusion with the most important results and findings. And also, I'm happy to answer any of your questions during this event, and we will also discuss some of the main findings and takeaways in the final fishbowl discussion this afternoon, I think at 4:45. All right, one brief note on methodology. I know most of you are mainly interested in the results, but just very briefly, how did we get all this data? How did we do the analysis? In the strictest sense, this is of course not a scientific study, because what was in the foreground was to also provide mentoring for those women who participated in the case study. They were divided into different peer groups, buddy groups, and most of the data collection was done online. On a bi-weekly basis, participants had to fill in an online survey, an online questionnaire that first of all collected general socio-demographic data, country of origin, age, gender, marital status, but also specific questions on their educational profile, their qualifications, their personality, their strategies for application and so on, with the aim of learning from them to see what works and what doesn't work. So the whole case study went on for a period of about 6 months, and at the end of the case study, participants had to fill in a post-case study questionnaire that also collected feedback on the whole process. And just a word of caution, this is not a representative survey, of course. So none of the results that I'm presenting today can be extrapolated or applied to another context in the UN. It's very specific to this case study and to these participants. Of course, we would always have liked to have more data and more participants, but I think it's a very good pilot study, I would call it, to get a first overview of some of the strategies that work and that don't work. Alrighty, just very briefly, I would like to start by giving you a sense of who the participants in this case study were. So you can see that most participants were in the age group 31 to 40 years of age, or 20 and 30 years. We only had a smaller share of respondents that was above the age of 40. This is already an important takeaway because we'll see that many respondents don't have a lot of work experience. They have some, but not a lot. And this is also a learning for the UN, namely that very young female candidates might need more guidance and mentoring when it comes to understanding the system and understanding the workplace of an international organization. Concerning origin, you see that most of our respondents came from Europe and North America. We also had some participants from Africa, Asia, and South America. And marital status, this is something that we found important because, as I said, we can't really look at the United Nations in a vacuum. There's always a larger social context to consider. There are responsibilities, additional responsibilities to consider. So in this case, most of our respondents were single or married in a partnership. And we also asked this question, which an employer is not legally allowed to ask in Austria, but for our purposes it seemed important, whether the candidates were planning on having a family in the next couple of years. And here you can already see that the answers were not that clear-cut. So most of them said definitely not, probably not, or it's even not applicable, which also I think refers back to the rather young age structure and the sense that first of all, for those women who participated in the case study, it was the career was prioritized for the moment of the study. Now, concerning skills and qualifications, this is not really surprising because as a basic precondition, all participants in the case study had to have a university degree, and indeed, most of them even had a master's degree. So we have a very educated group of candidates. And we even had some candidates with a doctoral degree. So it's a very educated group of professional women, despite their quite young age structure. Additional skills are interesting to see. So our applicants were typically fluent in more than one language, of course. They typically had 2 additional languages. On an average, the average participant was fluent in 3.2 languages. Another interesting takeaway was that more than half of all participants said that they dedicated quite an extensive amount of their time to voluntary work, and this voluntary work was either related to their employer or to personal interest. And at the very end of my presentation, I'm also going to share the example of one successful candidate who actually scored a job at the end of the 6-month period. And what distinguished her was indeed that she has been very active in voluntary work for several years already. And this seems to be a really distinguishing factor because you can, of course, learn a lot from your voluntary experience that can then be applied to the professional context. And also the networking part of voluntary work, I think, is important. Computer skills were also assessed. So typically, the classic applications participants feel very confident about, but had less knowledge in programming or in databases. And this has to do also with the kind of jobs they applied for. So it was not within informatics, for instance, or technology-driven sectors, but rather, as I said, in the more humanitarian work-oriented positions. Work experience is one of the first aspects that we looked into in more depth. And here the question that we asked was, first of all, how many years of actual work experience do you have in your main area of expertise? So this was not in the current job, but rather in your area of expertise. And you can see that most of our respondents had between 5 and 10 years of experience, which means that this qualifies them for level P3 positions at the UN, which require at least 5 years of experience, as you might know. We also have some respondents that have more than 10 years, which is already quite a lot. As I said, it's a young cohort of respondents, so this is already quite extensive work experience. And again, referring back to this case of the one successful candidate who scored a job offer, she indeed was in the group with the highest work experience, more than 10 years. So work experience does seem to be a crucial issue. And when we talk about very young applicants, this is something where we also have brought some recommendations on how to tweak your CV perhaps a little bit to reach this. Okay. Yeah, maybe one word on the areas of expertise that might be interesting. Which areas were candidates qualified in? So this was mainly management and administration, economic and social development, mental health and staff counseling, HR, budget and finance, and legal expertise. So then the second question related to work experience was the current job. How many years have you been in your current job? And here it's interesting to see, and again I would connect this to the young age structure of respondents, that most of them had been in their current job for less than 2 years, so the column at the very bottom. And also we had quite a significant share of respondents who said that at the time of participating in the case study they were unemployed. And this is of course important to know because it might account for a higher flexibility concerning job search, a higher willingness to relocate and also to apply to different agencies, so to be broader in your search, simply because there might be more urgency to your job search. And the majority of respondents also said that they were currently not in a supervisory role, which I think is again connected to the fact that they had not that much work experience in the current job, and so they were not in the role of a superintendent or supervision. Job satisfaction was also rated in the case study. How satisfied are you in your current job? And this question was assessed by asking respondents to rate their job satisfaction on a scale from 1 for not at all satisfied to 10 for very satisfied. You can see that the great majority of respondents, namely 2/3 of them, actually located on the positive end of the spectrum, so choosing values between 6 and 10, which speaks for the current job satisfaction, I think. However, we do have a considerable number of respondents, it was 1 in 10, who chose the lowest value, 1, not at all satisfied in their current job. And again, similar like for the group who are currently unemployed, this might account for a higher flexibility when it comes to searching a new job, a higher flexibility also with regards to relocating to other countries or to applying to a variety of UN agencies rather than only one preferred candidate. Now we talk a bit about the social factors. As I said, this is of course always important to take into consideration, because one of our findings was really that the larger social structures, the social context in which you are embedded as a candidate or as a professional working in the UN does matter a lot as concerns your chances for advancement and your chances of being hired in the first place. Now, most of respondents who were in a partnership or in a marriage said that their partner was employed, was currently working. And so here the question of relocation becomes more urgent, as you know, because relocation usually also means that the candidate's spouse or partner has to relocate. And we still live in a world, I think, where it's very common for the wife to relocate with her husband if he's offered a job, but it's not so common for the other way around, right? And so this might actually be an issue for some female candidates. And indeed, what we found in the answers to these questions, would your spouse or partner be willing to relocate if the position you are applying for required it? There were several respondents who said yes or maybe, but quite a large amount of them said not applicable, so it was neither nor. And I think this indicates a certain unease with this question, so I'm not quite sure of how to answer this. Maybe I haven't even touched upon this subject yet with my partner, but it's certainly something to consider, and also something where I think the UN, as the potential employer, could be more proactive by already at the beginning of the recruitment making it very clear what sort of the benefits or assistance for the partner might be, so that he could also find a job in the new country they are moving to. Connected to this is the share of housework, very interesting. So we basically just asked how many hours a week do you spend on housework. So for the female candidates, they said they spent between 2 hours per week to 90 hours per week, which makes for an average of 12.9 hours per week. And for the husband or partner, they said that he dedicated 0 to 100 hours per week, so a wide array really, and this makes an average of 9.7 hours a week. So you can see, even for highly professional women, highly educated women, the load is not evenly distributed, right? And as I said, this does affect also professional lives and career chances. Work-life balance, closely connected to paid work, but also unpaid work at home. We asked respondents how satisfied they were with the balance of time spent on paid work and other aspects of life. Again, they rated this question on a scale from 1, not at all satisfied with work-life balance, to 10, very satisfied. I think it's a very mixed picture. We do have the majority of respondents who said that they are rather or fairly satisfied, choosing values 7, 8, 9. But we also have some respondents, it was about a tenth of them, who said that they were not at all satisfied. They chose the value 1 or value 2, so only slightly satisfied. And of course, this is something that should also be taken into consideration. As I said, UN jobs are very demanding. And what can the UN do and offer to make sure that job satisfaction increases and that the work-life balance is maintained? Personality, this was the final set of questions that we ask, because here it's of course interesting to see what sort of personality, also talking about professional personas, work best for the UN. Which sort of character traits would be important? What sort of strategies should be applied? And we ask our respondents how confident they feel about doing the following activities, all related to finding a job successfully. What you can see is that, for instance, they were very confident about completing a job application or resume, which is in the middle of the graph. They felt very confident about this. They also felt rather confident about using social networks to discover promising job openings. And indeed, this was revealed as a very important skill to have. So I think this conference is already a first step towards successful networking. However, what we also saw is that while they were confident about networking with their peers in the peer group, with buddies and so on, with other candidates, they were less confident with contacting and networking with potential employers, or even persuading employers proactively to consider them for a job. I don't have any data on male candidates, but I'm assuming that we might have gotten a bit of different results here, that there might be more confidence perhaps. And this is something that also needs to be addressed, I think. Also and this connects back to the second question on personality that we asked, we had a set of items that candidates were asked to rate whether this item, this personality trait, applied to them or not. I think it's hard to, no, I think you can read it. What we found out was, first of all, and this is not so surprising, I think, that those character traits typically associated with a social and a caring personality, and I would say with classic conceptualizations of womanhood and of femininity, those were ranked the highest actually. So many candidates described themselves as very helpful to others, or as aware of feelings of others. So I think this is clearly also female connotated. Or also they said that they are very understanding. On the other hand, characteristics that are more clearly associated with a professional persona, with advancing in a professional context, like for instance, can make decisions easily, stands up very well under pressure, were not rated that highly by the respondents. And one aspect here I think is very striking. It's the second from the top, very self-confident. Only a very minor share of respondents said that they feel very self-confident. On the other hand, and this I think is connected to the fact that this character trait has a negative connotation in the professional context, very emotional in the very middle of the graph. Again, only a minor share said that they would describe themselves as very emotional. Like I said, I think this also has to do with the fact that this was a case study in the professional context, asking about their professional persona and not their private one. What are candidates looking for in a job at the UN? So this is a question connected to job desirability and candidates' motivation for applying for a job at the UN. The hypothesis was that candidates typically have a very high intrinsic motivation. So typically you apply to the UN because you share the organization's mission and purpose, and indeed this was the top answer here. Also, what many candidates said is really important to them in a job is to have good training opportunities, to be able to be proactive and to use their own initiative, so also to be self-reliant at work. The reputation of the organization was mentioned as being very important. I think this is a classic example for why the UN draws such a large number of applicants and is so attractive worldwide. But also importantly, many candidates said that it's really important for them to be able to combine work and family responsibilities. And again, I think this is less of a takeaway for you, but more of a takeaway for the UN as an organization, to say that, hey, if you really want to attract more female candidates, please make sure to invest in these aspects. Candidates' familiarity with the UN system, of course, it can never hurt to be familiar with the UN before you start applying there. And as I said, we have a rather young age structure of candidates with fair to limited work experience. So in general, their familiarity with professional contexts might be limited, even more so when it comes to work in international organizations. However, what we see in our answers here is that the candidates were very familiar with official languages, clearly. They also showed themselves familiar with UN Women, with the Sustainable Development Goals, with the 2030 Agenda. The structure and organization, however, of the UN, so this sort of hard skills that would be most important for applying, to know who can you call, who do you have to talk to, also when you already are working at the UN, how do you advance in the system. This is something that is not that widely known. And I think here again, the UN could invest already at the beginning of the recruitment process to make information on these things more readily available, especially for young female candidates. So I already briefly touched upon this in my introductory remarks. We had one participant in this whole case study who was successful already at the end of the 6 months trial period and who managed to score a job offer at the UN. And because I think we might be able to learn a lot from her case, just some very basic parameters and characteristics that define her. So she was of the age group 41 to 50 from a non-European country. And during the time of the case study, she submitted 4 applications to 4 different UN agencies. So she showed a great flexibility as concerns job search in different geographical locations as well. She had 6 pre-screening assessment tests, 4 of them written, 2 of them oral. And at the end of this, she got an offer for a P4 position, so already an advanced position in the system. I think this also has to do with her skills and her experience. So she had a university degree. Her language skills were rather limited, I would say. So most candidates in the case study had more than 2 languages. But I think what was really her main advantage was she had extensive work experience, 5 to 10 years in the current job. She was in a supervisory role, and she also indicated high job satisfaction, high satisfaction with her work-life balance. So she seemed to be very grounded also in what she was doing with a great background of years of experience. And this translated into her persona, I think. She showed strong self-confidence and high familiarity with the UN system. And she was married, but her children were already grown up. They were adults. They were not living with her in the same household. So she was able to be very flexible when it comes to international postings and applying to different agencies. And also, I think what most distinguished her, and this is something that also those of you who don't have this, these many years of work experience can take away from this, she was a very active networker. So she was a very active member in the case study group, interacted with peers and mentors, shared a lot of things, did a lot of networking and so on. And combined with a high career adaptability, this is, I think, what her main asset was as a sort of takeaway. Right, I'm coming to my conclusion. First of all, some very brief recommendations for the UN in general. What could the UN do to increase the number of successful female candidates? First of all, our recommendation would be to provide a much more structured application process. And as I mentioned several times now, to provide guidance, counseling, and targeted mentoring for female applicants, to make sure that female applicants, every applicant basically, finds the information they need and makes an informed decision on which agencies they're applying for, which geographical locations are available to them, and so on. We also think that the recruiting process, and this is something that we learned from conversations with female staff at the UN, the recruitment process can be very lengthy, very long drawn out, and very one-sided. So you don't hear back from HR for a considerable stretch of time. It leaves candidates in the dark. It's difficult to handle this, and this can actually lead, on the one hand, to demotivation of candidates, and also it can lead to a reorientation of them. So you're losing important, valuable talent along the way, because they might be, while waiting to hear back from the UN, applying for positions in the private sector, but usually the recruitment process is much more transparent and much quicker. And so this is also something that the UN should be more aware of, simply to be more transparent and to have a sort of mutual recruiting process. And finally, we do think that already at the beginning of the application process, candidates' gender-specific challenges should be addressed more openly and transparently. So already tell the candidates, and not only those who are successful, that what the individual packages for moving can be, what assistance is offered to children or to partners, what the pension schemes and healthcare packages are, what the general support system looks like, because this might be an important reason to decide for or decide against a position in a country which was not at the top of your list, perhaps, or deciding for or against a certain UN agency. So we think this is very important. And then finally, some of the takeaways for you as candidates. These are just very brief tips and recommendations. You can find all of them also on the executive summary that is available at the registration desk. We think, once again, it's very important to be proactive. Some ideas on how to do this would be to set automatic job alerts, to keep the LinkedIn profile updated, to network online but also offline as often as you can be, and you're doing a first step here by attending this conference. Ideally even to find someone in a UN agency who you can talk to find a mentor. This would be the ideal case, right? And then connected to this is very much the fact that you need to be confident in your own skills and qualifications. What we also saw is that very often candidates chose a job that was clearly below their actual pay grade and below their qualifications. This is not how we want to start. So be confident and apply for the job that really fits your profile, that fits your work experience and your educational profile. Be flexible, as I said. This is, of course, always an individual question everyone has to answer for themselves. How flexible can you be? But in general, it pays off to not only apply to one agency and one position, but to spread out your search. Be involved in voluntary work, very important. Ideally, voluntary work that might be related to the professional work you're trying to get into. And I think in a city like Vienna, there are ample opportunities to be active in voluntary work. Get familiar with all aspects of the UN system, not only those that sort of broadcast via media and that are easily accessible, but also try to dive into the organization and its structure, its decision-making processes to understand the internal logic. Invest time in finding the right job that really matches your skills. Don't just apply to everything, because this is a waste of your resources, a waste of your energy. So save this for the right job. And also don't become demotivated by this long application process. Everyone has to go through this. I mean, maybe Darline can also share some of her experiences there. It can be very cumbersome and intransparent, but I think it pays off in the end. So really stick to it and don't lose hope. So these would be some of our most important recommendations. I'm going to stop my presentation now. I thank you very much for your attention. And as I said, if you have any immediate urgent questions, feel free to ask me, and I'm also available to talk to you in the coffee break. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. If it's okay with you, we just have a few more minutes left. Maybe we could open 3 questions to the floor, and then we go into the coffee break. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Any questions? Yes.
Hey, did you come across any fellowship programs for experienced professionals that allow the UN to recruit outside of the digital platform?
This was not a focus of our case study here, but I think that, Adelina, I'm looking at you, you're probably aware of fellowship programs, and I think this is something that will come up in the course of the conference. With our case study group here, it was only, candidates were only recruited from the online groups via Facebook mostly, and then they participated in the online survey. So they were not enrolled in any fellowship program at the point. But this actually came up as one of the recommendations that it's related, I think, to this whole idea of mentoring and guidance, right? And so being able to have a very structured program that also tells you, or it gives you advice on how to apply and what sort of the skills are that you need would be very helpful for many candidates. And this is what they also feedbacked. Yeah.
Sorry, kind of a follow-up. Is there like an internal UN management program targeting women to kind of formalize their goals to increase female management throughout the organization?
You're asking if there is something that...
Yeah.
Darline, I have to forward this to you. Is there something like this, a formal group? Because the WIO network is, of course, a voluntary...
Yeah.
You are outside of the organization.
Outside the UN, so it depends which organization, we call them agency. It depends which agency that you're applying to. So they may have. This is something that we share when we are part of the Facebook. If we know, we direct you if they do have some of these qualifications. But this is outside of the network because this will be after you get hired.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious if there's like any...
But there are agencies that do have it. We call them agencies, but they are groups that you could find that online. But I would recommend, if you do want to find out, a lot of the organization, they have a page right now because they're going towards gender parity that's dedicated to women. So you could see what they have available, what they're offering. But that's after you get hired. So we are focusing on before you get hired. So it's a big step. It's a different step.
Any other questions? Yes.
Javier Galindo speaking. One question, is the study, or in the study participated only women which were living in Austria or also women from other countries?
Other countries as well, yeah. Yeah. And it was not only the agencies that are located here in Vienna, but it was really globally. So they could apply to any other agency as well.
So just to give you some background, the case study, it was mostly online. Sorry. So the case study was mostly online. So it wasn't face-to-face. So a lot of the interaction was done virtually because we wanted participants from all over the world. So I will talk about, we had coordinators. They really work really hard in trying to coordinate people from different parts of the world to really come together to do this. So it's from different countries. I think you pointed that out. So a lot of them were from European countries, and we had people from North America, and also different countries. So it wasn't. We just went worldwide.
Another question before the coffee break? Yeah.
Hi there, my name is Sandra, and I have more like a comment or suggestion for recommendations to the UN. At 0 point is do a better advertising, especially in the area of IT, for example, because what was happening is there are 130 candidates. We would be getting only 13 women candidates.
Yeah.
So then there is a really like less opportunity.
And use channels like the WIO Network for advertising.
So that's one of the things that we have the Facebook group. We share this information that people will see it's available when it's out there, so that you could see that it's available. But it's, I think part of the case study, we look at that also. Like, we asked the participants, how did you find this job? Where did you see it? We asked those questions, but it's true. It's sometimes it does exist, but it's hard to find. So that's why you have to have some kind of connection beforehand before you actually could get in.
Okay, one more question.
Hello, my name is Mechthild. I have just one question on the structure of your study. In the first third of your presentation, you said that it's, on the one hand, important to be eligible, to have a considerable command over work experience, and in the same time, to be very experienced with voluntary work. So the question is, has it been clearly distincted as two different tasks, or is it possible that the voluntary work has been accounted partly to the work experience in your study?
No, it was clearly distinguished, paid work and voluntary work. So the difference was made, the difference was the payment really. So voluntary work was defined as engaging in activities that you are not paid for, that might be related to your work. A classic example would be Darline in her role as the founding member, the founder of the WIO Network, right? This is voluntary work, although it's very much connected to her professional role, of course. But this would be counted as voluntary work. However, we also had some women in the case study who engaged in voluntary work that was not at all connected to their professional persona or to their job, right? So, for instance, in Vienna, I remember one candidate who was based in Vienna, and she was very active in refugee support groups. That had nothing to do, and she was not working at UNHCR, but she was working at a different UN agency. So you could say, of course, well, in general, she's interested in humanitarian work, so there might be a connection, but not on the basis that this is a one-to-one match, really. So it's a very broad definition of voluntary work, but the main distinction was that you're not being paid for this, and it's being in addition to your job.
Thank you for that very consoling answer.
Sorry, last question. One more? Okay.
Hi, very briefly, were the respondents in your study first-time candidates to UN, or do they have prior experience, with UN work?
Yes. So I think you brought this up. We split up the participants based on their familiarity with the UN system, if they apply. Yes, we had groups that they never heard about the UN, they were just thinking about it. So that's why you have different age. So we had those participants, and then we tried to mix a bit, but we had people that had experience that never applied, or they had applied the last 6 months, or they did internship, or, it's how familiar they are with the system. Mm-hmm. The participant that actually has a prior, she worked in international organizations in general, so she's familiar with the system. So she has connections, so network, so that's important. So she, but that's the requirement. If you really want to do it, what I'm saying is that's kind of the requirement, because information, there's a lot of information, but you don't know exactly what target information. Because the UN they have their website and everything, but before you find the right information that's going to get you to the next phase, it's difficult to find it. So that's why the networks are important, because they could direct you, they could guide you to that.
Okay, well, I invite you to the coffee break, and you could keep asking questions and interact.
Thank you very much. Thank you.